Hi there! Another month is already halfway past, which means it is high time that I tell you about the books that I read in April. I've got a good mix of some fantasy, some sci-fi, and some non-fiction to get you through. Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host, Jules, and I have to start this episode with an admission, which is that usually I would be giving you a Let's Get Medieval episode this week. And I do have an episode in mind. I have a text that I've read and that I'm thinking about, but because it's a text that is slightly outside of not slightly, that is quite outside my own field of research, I want to do a little bit more work. I want to read into it a little bit more before I share it with you, just to make sure that I do actually give the right kind of information. And that's why the Let's Get Medieval episode will be delayed to next week so that I can read up a little bit more. And today you're getting the books that I read in April, and hopefully that is still exciting because I do have some good books in there. Some very interesting ones, some very intriguing ones, popular favorites like Iron Flame, although actually I think that wasn't quite as favored as Fourth Wing was, but we'll get into all of that. So let's actually just get right into it. The first book I read, or rather finished in April, was Someone You Can Build a Nest In by John Wiswell. I wanted to read you the delightful blurb on Goodreads, but I actually think it's quite spoilery. There's no need to put that much information into a blurb, publishers. It's good to give readers an overview of what is going to happen roughly in the book, but you don't want to give away the first half, basically. Anyway, that's just a minor rant for free. Someone You Can Build a Nest In is a delightful kind of monster-slaying fantasy romance. That's how it's built, but it's told from the perspective of the monster, and she's called Shesheshen. She's a shapeshifter, and she's just quite happy to live in this ruined manor. She lives at the bottom of the lake where she's hibernating, and she's just this blob. That's how I pictured her. She doesn't really have a solid shape, being a shapeshifter, but kind of her natural state is just very much, it oozes. And she's hibernating, she's doing absolutely fine, and then hunters break into her manor, because it turns out this manor used to belong to a family who've had a grudge against the monster of the region for ages, and their prodigal son now wants to defeat the monster, because they believe the monsters put a curse on their family. Shesheshen is sleeping, and then these men come in, and she's like, what am I going to do now? So she has to drag herself out of this pond and create a shape for herself. But she is kind of chased out of her mansion. And along the way where she's hurt, she ends up encountering a woman called Homily. And Homily is super nice, and she takes care of Shesheshen, who's kind of taken a sort of human shape. And she takes care of her wounds, and they're connecting, because Homily clearly also has a tragic past, and Shesheshen doesn't know what she's feeling, but she thinks it might be love. Is Homily someone she could build a family with, which in her case means plant her eggs into? It's confusing for a monster to suddenly experience all these feelings, especially if she's never felt it before, right? And that's when something of a minor twist occurs, and there is some drama, but we get loads of conversations about what it means to be a monster, what it means to maybe fall in love, what it means to bear the weight of a family on your shoulders. And I found this book absolutely delightful. The tone is something I find hard to describe, but it felt very light, and yet John Wiswell discusses things like trauma and finding your place in the world and feeling lost and not quite knowing what's going on, and he includes all of that into a story which has this delightful found family aspect. There are romance overtones, but the romance, although it is central because it's about kind of a monster trying to figure out if they've fallen in love, it is not a forced kind of romance. And this will come back when I get to maybe Iron Flame later on, where I'm like, there's a lot of sex scenes and tension here, which is delightful in its own way. But what I enjoyed about Someone You Can Build a Nest In is that Sheshishen and Homily spend so much of their time talking and communicating, and even though they're both keeping some secrets, I mean, Sheshishen is a literal, like, shapeshifting monster, like, how do you bring that up on a first date? But they're still kind of checking in with each other's boundaries, respecting each other's kind of triggers or traumas, and all of that is done without making it explicit. Again, I don't quite know how to explain this, but this, for example, would be a really good book, I think, for people to read who think that things like talking about consent or queer sexuality, that those are forced into literature. This would be an excellent book to give them, to show, like, no, you can actually introduce this in a way that is representative, that is respectful and fun in a narrative. Like, it's good. I really enjoyed Someone You Can Build a Nest In. It was an excellent start to my reading month. There would be a slight warning for, I guess, body horror, because we're dealing with a shape-shifting monster that creates different bodies for itself. But truly, this was excellent. And I think I'm definitely going to reread it come like October spooky time, when I need to cancel out some of the more horrific reads. This is like nicely gory without sort of making me break out in shivers. The next book I read was also somewhere along this slightly scary, slightly comfy side, and that is The Monstrous Mrs. Mai by Van Hoang. In this case, I am actually going to read you the blurb from Goodreads. Los Angeles brims with opportunity in 1959, though not for aspiring fashion designer Cordelia Mai Yin, the first-generation child of Vietnamese immigrants who finds the city unkind to outsiders and as dispirited as her own family. When Cordy rents a cheap loft in an old apartment building, she quickly warms to kindred souls Tessa, Audrey, and Silly. They also want better things and have pasts that they rather forget. That they all share the same middle name makes their friendship seem like destiny. As supportive as they are of each other, it's a struggle just to eke out a living, let alone hope to see their wishes for success come true. Until an ever-present and uncannily charming acquaintance of the landlord's offers a solution to their problems. He promises to fulfill their every dream. All it takes is a little magic and a small sacrifice. As one surprisingly effective spell leads to another, their wishes get bigger, but so does the price they must pay. Amid the damaged seams of her life so far, Cordy must realize her own power in order to rip free, without losing everything she's worked so hard to achieve. I started reading The Monstrous Mrs. Mai on a train, and as I was kind of speeding through the German countryside, it was delightful to be transported to this 1950s LA, and Van Hoang really brings that LA to life, and especially because Cordy is really our main character here, because she is a seamstress and a designer. She has a lot of attention to detail, so the way that she also describes LA and, you know, just everything from the furniture in their apartment to the clothes that she's wearing or designing, she has an eye for detail. And that really brings the entire environment to life. And therefore, I also really enjoyed kind of sinking into the world. I did have some issues with the pacing of the novel. I felt like initially it started out quite well, but it took some time to build up Cordy as your main character, which I thought was good, like, let me get to know her. And then just things kept happening, and I wasn't quite sure of what tension was being built, kind of what the tension arc was going to be, if that makes sense. And I felt like the characters were kind of being a little bit naive when it came to the magic system. So I do think the magic system was cool, because in many ways, The Monstrous Mrs. Mai is a historical fiction novel set, like I said, in 1950s LA, perceiving America through a lens of first-generation immigrants. But there is a magic system, which seems to be commonly accepted in the world, or rather there's, these neighborhood preachers who stand on corners of streets yelling about Laura, which is what the system is called. And Laura is basically a magic which will allow you to fulfill your dreams as long as you sacrifice something that really means something to you. And they kind of get tricked into doing this first spell by this handsome stranger who shows up. And I was like, girls, there are so many red flags with this man already. Like, why would you allow him to do magic? Even if you don't believe that it's going to work, why would you allow this man into your apartment to do some kind of weird spell? But it kind of starts going from there, right? And things start coming true, and suddenly they seem to have access to everything they've ever desired, which they've never been given access to being immigrants. And I think that kind of theme of the novel, of trying to struggle for success, but also a place to feel home and having your work recognized, and then feeling like you've taken a shortcut, which completely undermines all the work you've done. Whereas there are all these rich and happy people who have no issue taking shortcuts, and they don't feel like it attacks their worth, but you do because you've had to work so hard. I think that was a great theme, and therefore I did really enjoy the novel because it got me thinking about that. Although I had some issues, like I said, with the main characters, where I was like, I feel like you're being set up to be purposefully naive so we can bring the narrative into a specific direction. I would have liked our characters to be a little bit more on point, to have recognized things a little bit quicker, but I guess the naivety also kind of plays into the character development. So yeah, but I thought this was a really interesting novel. I think it is a very valuable kind of description of what it's like to be a first-generation immigrant, to struggle with the burden of expectations from your parents and a feeling at home in a place that doesn't actually expect you to be from there. And again, that balance between, am I allowed to take a shortcut to success, or do I need to work for everything? Is what I've achieved now actually mine, or do I still owe it to others? How much am I willing to sacrifice of myself to make it in a society of other people? I think those were excellent themes, and because of that, I did very much enjoy The Monstrous Mrs. Mai and would absolutely recommend it. After delving into some mildly horror-ish books, because there is death in The Monstrous Mrs. Mai, I decided that it was time to face real-life horror. And I found a book which allowed me to do that, and that is The Patriarchs, The Origin of Inequality by Angela Saini. For this, I'm going to give you the blurb again from Goodreads. For centuries, societies have treated male domination as natural to the human species. But how would our understanding of gender inequality, our imagined past and contested present, look if we didn't assume that men have always ruled over women? If we saw inequality as something more fragile that has had to be constantly remade and reasserted? In The Patriarchs, The Origins of Inequality, award-winning science journalist Angela Saini explores the roots of what we call patriarchy, uncovering a complex history of how it first became embedded in societies and spread across the globe from prehistory into the present. She travels to the world's earliest known human settlements, analyzes the latest research findings in science and archaeology, and traces cultural and political histories from the Americas to Asia. In the 19th and 20th centuries, philosophers, historians, anthropologists, and feminists began to actively question what patriarchy meant as part of the attempt to understand the origins of inequality. In our own time, despite the pushback against sexism, abuse, and discrimination, even revolutionary efforts to bring about equality have often ended in failure and backlash. But The Patriarchs is a hopeful book, one that reveals a multiplicity to human arrangements that undercuts the old grand narratives and exposes male supremacy as no more and no less than an ever-shifting element in systems of control. So I read Inferior, How Science Got Women Wrong, by Angela Saini a while back. So when I saw The Patriarchs in the bookstore, I thought, excellent. Angela Saini is a great writer, and I am very intrigued to see what she's kind of put together in this book, because I've read works about the patriarchy and some of the works that she quotes, that kind of research from the 19th and 20th centuries. I've read some of that and I was aware that it was outdated, but I didn't know what the next step was. And The Patriarchs kind of offered me that next step. It kind of summarized what the different fields that are under discussion, such as archaeology and history and philosophy, how they've continued to work with those ideas and which new steps they've made. Admittedly, this book is bright pink. I think it got affected by the Barbie craze. So I did feel like I was holding up a pink flag every time I read it in public, but I really enjoyed this book. Like I said, Angela Saini is a great writer. She manages to take quite complex, sometimes scientific ideas and present them to you in a way that that makes sense, that is easily accessible, even if you don't have a background in the fields from which that research emerges. So, for example, I'm obviously a literary scholar, I'm a medievalist. So when she talked about certain findings from the Viking Age, for example, I was aware of those. But if she talks about prehistoric Iron Age burials, that is outside my comfort zone. When she talks about research into primates, that's not necessarily something where I understand all the terminology. And she manages to bring that together really well. I also like how sharp she was in some of her commentary, especially when commenting upon previous scholarship, especially work by male academics who just literally wrote down, men have always been superior and in charge. That's just how it works. There's no point in arguing against that. And she's like, well, actually, let me show you the evidence. So I thought she brought together a lot of very interesting things. What I did realize is now that I am working in academia myself again and am writing academic papers, I've realized how massive the gulf is between what academics can say and what journalists or authors of kind of popular science books can say. When I am presenting my research, I have to make incredibly clear that not a lot of it is set in stone, right? That all the findings that I make, even in my field, that they are open to interpretation, that there is quite simply evidence that we don't have, there are things that we don't know. And I understand, and especially with, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic, I understand how frustrating that can be to an audience, that you get an academic there who's meant to be an expert and they refuse to say yes or no to a question because we can't from our tradition, right? We have to always add that further research could open other avenues, that extra information could show us that this is wrong or actually that is right. Whereas a lot of popular writers don't have to do that. So I struggled with that a little bit, especially considering how broadly this book kind of takes its perspective. It does move across the continents, across time, and Angela Saini does that really well. She shows how these different periods are connected. Sometimes I couldn't entirely follow the jump, but then once we kind of got started with a new chapter and a new place, I was like, oh, okay, I see how this links now. But she takes a very big perspective, like I said, and I had to let go a little bit of my academic instinct to say, okay, but what's the evidence? Are you absolutely sure? Can you say that? Where's the evidence? But there are very extensive notes at the end of the book. And I've highlighted a lot of that. I've already downloaded a lot of the papers that she mentions because I think that'll be interesting to my own research as well, right? So in that sense, I would absolutely recommend the Patriarchs to anyone who's interested in how patriarchy developed, and people especially who are interested in kind of seeing these structures of control and recognizing the ways in which control shifts, and how power shifts and how we have conversations about that as well. For that, it's a very valuable book. Angela Saini brings a lot of very interesting research to the table. For myself, I sometimes feel a little hesitant about the strong statements that get made in books like these, but that is just my own academic, like I said, instinct that wants to just, always put a little asterisk at the end of a sentence that says, well, we'll know more in 10 years' time, because we always do. But The Patriarchs is an excellent book to bring you up to date to what most scholarly fields currently consider patriarchy to be, but also just gender roles in general. And it's also, it's easy to read. Like, there's a lot of knowledge there, but Angela Saini makes it understandable for you. So I would highly recommend The Patriarchs. The next book I read is actually a book that someone lent to me months ago, and I finally realized I should read this so I can give it back to them. And that is The Dance Tree by Kiran Millwood Hargrave. I read The Mercies by Kiran Millwood Hargrave, and I'd actually lent that book to this person, and they enjoyed it, even though it made them feel claustrophobic, the way it did for me as well. So they then went out to buy The Dance Tree and read it and told me to read it. and that's how we've been passing books back and forth. For this one, I'm going to read you the blurb from Goodreads as well. Strasbourg, 1518. In the midst of a blisteringly hot summer, a lone woman begins to dance in the city square. She dances for days without pause or rest, and when hundreds of other women join her, the men running the city declare a state of emergency and hire musicians to play the devil out of the mob. Outside the city, pregnant Lisbeth lives with her husband and mother-in-law, tending the bees that are the family's livelihood. Though Lisbeth is removed from the frenzy of the dancing plague afflicting the city's women, her own quiet life is upended by the arrival of her sister-in-law. Netha has been away for 7 years, serving a penance in the mountains for a crime no one will name. It is a secret Lisbeth is determined to uncover. As the city buckles under the beat of 1,000 feet, Lisbeth becomes caught in a dangerous web of deceit and clandestine passion. Like the women of Strasbourg, she too is dancing to a dangerous tune. So I was aware of these dancing plagues, these choreomanias, which took root in the early modern period. And I've always found them fascinating because I just can't imagine how you would get there. And yet, on the other hand, it has been depressingly hot almost here the past 2 days. Like, I can feel the heat building up, the pressure building up. And we've been promised thunderstorms for days now. And I'm just waiting for something to break that pressure. And I think with that in mind, I can kind of understand how these women started dancing. But what is really interesting is how this novel is broken up. So it starts with a kind of very brief, a page or two, perspective of the first woman who starts dancing. And then we get Lisbeth's story, and we get to see her perspective, her life, kind of her marriage, and how she's lost a lot of children so far, and she's hoping to finally be able to carry this one to term, and how there is this mystery of her sister-in-law who'd been sent away for penance. And then you get another quick, okay, now there are 38 women dancing. You get another page or two about another woman who joins in on the dancing. And the way that the novel kind of flips back and forth between this focused narrative on Lisbeth and on her struggles as a woman who's also trying to figure out her own identity, maybe separately from her husband, her mother-in-law, her future child. You also get the perspective of these women who break and join the dance. And through that, I think there's quite an interesting commentary on gender roles, on the expectations of women, the potential burden to keep up a facade. And that's an aspect I really enjoyed. I also enjoyed the story around Lisbeth. I think Lisbeth is a very interesting character. The sort of tentative relationship she builds up with her sister-in-law once she returns, and the relationship she has with another friend, the way that those kind of intermingle, and how it kind of echoes the mania of the dance. I think that is also done very well. Hargrave absolutely knows how to write a story in which there is tension and interesting characters. She seems to have a penchant for certain scenes. Like, now that I've read 2 books of hers, I can kind of recognize certain elements reappearing. For example, especially this triad of three women or 3 female identifying characters that kind of bounce off each other and that represent different aspects. I think that is, for example, something that I'm now recognizing, and I would like to read a 3rd book by her to see if that appears again. But I think Hargrave does a very good job bringing kind of this 1500s Strasbourg to life, the religious tension, the pressure of the heat. I think it's done very well. By the end, I was a little bit disappointed in how it ended. Not necessarily with what happened, but I think by the end, I just felt like some things had gone a bit, I almost said too smoothly, and that's not correct because that's not what I mean, but it all sort of tied up in a way where I was like, oh, that was surprisingly neat, considering how much potential there was for explosion and disaster. So yeah, by the ending, I was like, oh, okay. But for a historical novel, I was absolutely there for it with the dance tree. After diving into historical fiction, I decided to get as far away from Earth as I could, and I read Calypso by Oliver K. Langmead. This is a science fiction novel in verse. And I hadn't read a novel in verse in ages, and I struggled getting into it a little bit, but then once I was in, I was in. Here's the blurb. Rochelle wakes from cryostasis to take up her role on the colony ark Calypso, but she wakes to find the ship deserted and the interior taken over by a forest. As she explores and finds the last remaining members of the crew, she discovers a legacy of war conducted while she slept. The engineers and the botanists have different visions of how to build the world. The engineers would build a new utopia of technology. The botanists would have the planet bloom untouched by mankind. Both will destroy the other to ensure their vision of paradise prevails. And Rochelle, the last to wake on the Calypso, holds the balance of power in her hands. Now, the reason I read you that blurb is because I don't think it entirely reflects what happens in the novel. So I'm cheating in that way. But Rochelle is one of our main characters, and I would say she is the emotional protagonist of the novel. Like, hers is the perspective that most closely aligns still with that of a 21st century human living on Earth. Basically, she awakes from cryostasis, and she signed up for this mission to be one of the engineers, one of the functionaries, as this ship Calypso heads towards a new planet, which they will kind of terraform into a new paradise for a new group of settlers. And alongside her, we also get the perspective of Catherine, who is this kind of bioengineer, but she herself is also something of an engineered creature. And the best way I can describe her is as a nature catalyst. And her perspective in the book blew me away, especially towards the 50-60% mark. When Catherine touches down on the planet, I was overwhelmed almost, and I had to take a bit of a break because it was stunning what happened there, and I didn't quite want that to end yet. The third perspective we get is Sigmund. He is the mastermind really behind the idea of Calypso and behind the idea of finding a new planet. And we get very brief glances at his perspective, at how he grew up, how the idea first took shape, his disappointment that every time that humanity touched down on a new planet, we abused it in the same way that we did Earth, and therefore he wanted to go as far away as possible with a new group of colonists or settlers who were like children, like babies basically, who had no memories of Earth, who would just approach this new world as the gift that it is, rather than bringing bad expectations or ideas with them. And then every once in a while we get, or I think actually only once, we get the perspective of the Herald, a very vague figure who just gives us a bit of history on the ship itself, because the ship's been traveling for hundreds of years while the main three characters have been in cryostasis. And what is super interesting is that the crew of the ship have developed their own entire mythology and language and religion almost around their mission and around these three characters who are going to awaken and create a new world. So there is a kind of conflict there between, okay, how do we start a new world? How do we start a new civilization without bringing all the potentially negative aspects of an earthly culture with us? And I thought that was really interesting, and Rochelle kind of plays the role of questioner. Sigmund has this grand vision, and she's meant to be like, okay, wait, humanity isn't all bad. We actually have positive aspects. These new settlers maybe deserve some kind of help, etc. And because it's told in verse, which means that the entire novel is in verse, right? It has something slightly dreamlike and slightly prophetic. Unlike prose, verse does just obviously lean itself towards metaphor and towards something less solid. So for some who want a sci-fi novel with a lot of world building and explanation, this might not entirely be it. But for those who just want to sink into something new and inventive, this is absolutely the book for you. And what I also really liked is that the different narrations, so Rochelle, Catherine, and Sigmund, and then once also the Herald, their verse is laid out differently on the page. They have different kinds of rhymes, and you immediately visually recognize who is speaking or who is telling you what, and that's really interesting thing to do. So I really liked Calypso because it felt like a really inventive and exciting novel. I was a little disappointed towards the end because I felt like it suddenly got a bit overly, or unnecessarily rather, religious. Of course, you have this whole idea of a new civilization, a new green and lush planet like a Garden of Eden. And are we going to send these settlers in like blank slates, or are we going to give them, I don't know, commandments? So there is that religious thing in there already as well. And I just felt like towards the end, it kind of tipped into, well, the balance kind of tipped into a little bit too much for me. Might be completely different for others, but still, as an inventive and exciting sci-fi novel, I couldn't recommend Calypso by Oliver K. Langmead more. I have 2 more books for you. I'm aware this episode is getting surprisingly long. Hopefully I can edit it down a little bit. But the next book that I read was a thriller because I decided that along all the other books that I had started, which I then actually finished in May, so you hear about those in a few weeks, that I wanted something delightfully fun and thrilling for a Saturday afternoon. And so I read The In Crowd by Charlotte Vassell. And I only realized about a third in that this was actually the second in a series. And of course, a lot of thrillers do exist in series, right? The main character kind of becomes this like leading protagonist throughout. But what is so good, especially about this series, which is the D.I. Caius Beauchamp series, is that although I could tell that things had happened before, I in no way was missing out on character development, introduction to the world, etc. Vassell still built it up in a really good way, where I could tell that there was more to explore in a previous book, but I wasn't lost, so that was good. The In Crowd. Here's your blurb. Some people are in. On the last Saturday in August, politicos and socialites trade tidbits of gossip and sips of Pimm's under the tasteful bunting of a Richmond garden party. They'd never guess that the police are just a stone's throw away, pulling a body out of the River Thames. Some people wish they were. The drowning appears to be a tragic accident, until Detective Caius Beauchamp gets an unexpected tip. The victim, it seems, had enemies in high places. Did being on the wrong side of them get her killed? Either way, being out is absolute murder. That's how you write a blurb for a thriller. You give me some slight taglines, you give me something slightly sassy, and just enough of an idea of what the central crime is that I can go into it. And the thing is, actually, in The In Crowd, there are 2 crimes. So Caius Beauchamp is our detective. He is one of the most delightful detective characters I've read in a while. And this feels maybe slightly inappropriate to say about a thriller in which people get murdered. Like, thrillers are often about murder. But there was something so smooth and easy and gentle about this novel. I wouldn't necessarily call it a cozy thriller or a cozy detective book, but it is cozy adjacent, in part because it takes place in this kind of glitz and glamour world, and Caius stands outside of that but keeps getting involved because of the crimes that he's investigating. And he's just looking at it and he's like, what are these people? They feel like terrible people. And he himself, like I said, is delightful. So he's absolutely a step away from that kind of Sherlock-like detective figure who is incredibly intelligent and so smart and also incredibly rude to everyone around him. Like, Caius Beauchamp isn't looking down on anyone. He's communicating with his colleagues, with his team. He thinks that maybe he should cut down on carbs, but he loves bread, so he makes his own bread on the weekend, and he brings like snacks for one of his colleagues when he knows he's feeling kind of bad about something, you know. He's a lovely main character, and I'm absolutely going to read the first book of this series and any future ones that come out, just because I thought he was fun. But anyway, our central mystery is a body which is dragged out of the river. But there is also a cold case crime, and I love it when 2 different crimes get set up, and then over the kind of arc of the book, you start to suspect that actually maybe they're linked. I think that's super fun, because then you can start like remembering all those little details of like, oh, maybe this person from that was this, etc. So I did see some of the twists coming. I didn't see the main twist coming, which I maybe should have. At a certain point, I was like, maybe, no, no, that wouldn't happen. And then that came and I was like, Jesus Christ, that's horrifying. So yeah, I very much enjoyed my reading experience with the In Crowd. There's also something of a romance brewing, which then of course kind of gets involved in the crimes maybe as well. And so we have a kind of flitting back and forth between different perspectives as well. We have the potential romance interest who's also a maybe witness to something. We have Caius himself as our perspective and his colleagues in the police department. We sometimes get snippets of their perspective as well, which is really interesting. And I just enjoyed this very much. It was a really good time. I got the thrills of trying to solve a crime without kind of grim atmospheres, but also without a detective who had a superiority complex. So that was good. I almost couldn't pronounce complex there. But that brings us to the last book I finished in April. And Jesus Christ, it was a big one. So a while back, I read Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros because a friend lent me her copy and she'd read it and she was like, just read it, give it a go. And I said, okay. And then she also had Iron Flame already waiting for me. And so I read Iron Flame, the second book of the Empyrean by Rebecca Yarros. And this book is 640 pages. And I love a good long book. Don't get me wrong. I like big books and I cannot lie. But 640 pages for a romantasy is intense. Okay? At a certain point, I just hit that moment of exhaustion with a book where I was like, first of all, my wrists hurt from holding this hardback. And second of all, it's like, we're not done yet. Especially once I hit a point where I was like, this could have been an excellent closer maybe to the first book if we just cut everything a little bit. But I should maybe read you the blurb first, or maybe I'm not going to actually, in case you haven't read Fourth Wing. I'm just going to leave you slightly in the dark. I covered Fourth Wing in my last reading roundup, or maybe the one before, but it's about Violet who goes to an army school and she becomes a dragon rider, and she has a hot and heavy romance with Xaden, who is marked because his father took part in the rebellion and something is going on there. And then at the end there is a big reveal and everything changes, except nothing has changed yet. But there is information where you're like, ooh, are we world building, Rebecca? And then Iron Flame is like, yes, we are world building. And I think for some people who loved Fourth Wing because of the romance part of the romantasy, I think they might have been slightly disappointed with how much world building Iron Flame attempts to do. I say attempt because some of it felt a bit holy to me, in the sense of there were holes in it still. There were some things where I'm like, okay, good to have filled that out now. I don't know if that matches the way it came across in the first book, but Rebecca Yarros is absolutely doing work to fill in the map of the world, to make things make a little bit more sense, perhaps to expand the world beyond the school, and to also raise the stakes a little bit and develop some of the characters. And I did enjoy it. I did race through that book in a day and a half, but I did have moments where I was like, oof, can I keep going with this? And the answer was yes. Like, I could absolutely keep going, but coming off of a light and breezy and tightly plotted, well-paced thriller, I was like, this does feel big. And I don't know if it has to be that big. And I was thinking about, well, which scenes would I maybe cut as an editor? And there were a couple of things where I was like, I appreciate we're setting up a fragile period in the relationship that Violet and Xaden have, but we're belaboring the point. The lady doth protest too much. I don't know if we need that drama. I would maybe love it if romance books found a new way of creating tension without creating drama in relationships. Just to kind of see if we could have a series where a relationship is just stable throughout, you know, just partners that communicate the way they do in Someone You Can Build a Nest In by John Wiswell, which I mentioned at the beginning. Partners that communicate, that respect each other's boundaries, that maybe still make mistakes, but then address those. I would love to see if we could support a romantasy on the back of that. So Iron Flame is long. It is fun. But considering how long it is, the ending took me by surprise. So much relevant stuff, I feel, happens in literally 10 pages. where we'd been building up to a certain thing happening, to them working to trying to get something done. And then I literally missed the moment, the sentence in which it is done, because we moved on so quickly and then other things happened and then boom, ending. Obviously another cliffhanger for the third book, which comes out in January, I think. So yeah, I was like, wait, I waited 640 pages. You could have added another 2 just to explain this moment properly, because I missed it. I had to go back, and even then I was like, I don't actually know how this happened. But there were a lot of fun things in this book. I liked the dragons again. The dragons are great. I just got an advanced reading copy of a new book with dragons by Jen Lyons that I'm very excited about. I wonder if I'll like Iron Flame less after reading that, if it's good, or the other way around. Anyway, Iron Flame, it's a lot. Consider whether you have the time and the wrist strength to commit to this series. Maybe I should have just read them on Kindle, but my friend already had a copy and I was like, I'm not buying my own then. So we'll see how that goes in January. I'll probably keep going with it just because I'm in it now and I'm at least mildly intrigued where it goes, but I do hope these books do not get longer. I hope they get shorter. Just an editor, please get in there. I don't think many books have to be that long. Like War and Peace is long, but admittedly it has a lot of things to say, right? Same with Les Mis. Like they have things to say and things need to take time. I don't know if Iron Flame needed this much time. But I think that's enough complaining for me. Those were the books I read in April. I've already read quite a few interesting things in May so far, so I'm very excited to share those with you soon. And as promised, next week I'll be back with a Let's Get Medieval episode. And that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.